All right, so as I mentioned, strip piecing is one of my favorite methods of shortcut quilting. I'm going to show you some tips and techniques that will help make your strip piecing a little more efficient and more accurate and just work better for your quilts. So first of all, let's talk about cutting your own strips. As we make the Spinning Stars quilt, you're going to be cutting your own 1.5 inch strips. So I want to talk a little bit about how to cut strips efficiently from yardage and also how to get them nice and square so you don't end up with wonky strips or strips that kind of end in a V. So here we have some yardage. And as you know, when you buy fabric at the fabric store, those ladies are working hard and they don't always have time to cut your fabric perfectly square. They're just being efficient. And so when you get home from the fabric store, you might be tempted to just start, grab my ruler here, start measuring and cutting your strips. But here, if you look closely, my selvage edges aren't matched up. This piece is not going to be square. If I were to cut this strip right now, in fact, let's just cut a little one and you can kind of see. If I open this up, it's going to be just a little bit wonky, a little bit off. So we want to square up those edges, get them nice and square and straight. And we're going to do that. The first thing we need to do is match up those selvage edges, because that edge of our fabric is the edge that's already square at a square straight edge. So we want to create a nice 90-degree square angle. We're going to start with this. So I'm going to match up all my selvage and kind of refold. Sometimes you may even need to refold the fabric. And it's not off by too much, but it's off by enough that my strip would be misshapen. So I'm going to even bring it over to my iron and just repress that edge. That's going to help me out. This is where this long mat comes in handy, is I can spread my with the fabric folded in half all the way across. Sometimes it's tempting to fold your fabric this way and cut your strips across 4 folds, and that can lead to problems too. Your strip could kind of end up even a little zigzaggy. So definitely, for the best results, have only the one fold. Now I'm going to line up my new folded edge right along the line on this bottom edge of my cutting mat. And that means these edges should line up with a straight line as well. That way I know that these are 2 parallel edges. Now I'm going to take my cutting mat and my ruler. I could just, lay my ruler here and just kind of square off this edge, making sure my ruler's square, and just go ahead and cut. To just be extra accurate and safe, I like to flip it. That way, I can cover my fabric with the ruler. I can line up a line on my ruler along that folded edge as well. And then I get a really good 90-degree square angle. So when I start cutting my strips, they're going to be nice and square and they're going to open up straight and not in a V. Okay, so flip it back around. So now, obviously, if you're left-handed, you're going to do the opposite of what I'm doing. But if you're right-handed, now I'm going to start measuring the width of the strips I want to cut. So for example, if I'm cutting a 2-inch strip, I use my ruler as the guide rather than the mat as my guide. That again is going to help with the accuracy of the size of the strip. Hold that ruler really steady with your hand and push the rotary cutter away from you like you're cutting a pizza. Then I have a perfect square 2-inch strip, and it opens up nice and straight. And it's ready to sew. That's just taking that extra time to get an accurate square strip is gonna save so much headache down the road as we're adding multiple strips together. And from there, I can just start cutting. If I need multiple 2-inch strips, I can just start cutting my 2-inch strips and move my my ruler and rotary cut. I do suggest after you've cut at least 4 or 5 strips to maybe re-square your edge, because the fabric could shift a little. You might want to just re-square and get a nice crisp edge again before, especially if you're cutting multiple strips across the fabric. All right, so for those of you who love using pre-cuts, this is where they come in really handy. Those pre-cut 2.5-inch strips are so handy for getting a variety of prints that are pre-cut and ready to go. You're not having to fold and square multiple pieces of yardage to get a variety of different pre-cut or different strips. The beauty of pre-cuts. So one thing to keep in mind, however, is because pre-cuts come typically with a pinked edge, sometimes it's hard to know the exact width that I'm working on. What edge do I line up with my presser foot to get that perfect 1/4-inch seam? The reason these pre-cuts come from the manufacturer with the pinked edge is so that they come intact. They're not shredding and fraying in transport or in display at the quilt store, but they stay a lot cleaner that way. You do, however, get a lot of this fraying, so you might want to have a lint roller on hand. I definitely keep mine on hand when I'm working with pre-cuts, but it's worth it for the time saved and the expense saved in getting the variety of fabrics. So here I have my pre-cut 2.5-inch wide strip. I'm going to use my ruler and just measure and find out what is the exact width. Sometimes with these pinked edges, the peak of that strip, the little tip, the points, might be beyond the 2.5 inches sometimes, and it's the valley of that pinked edge that's the 2.5-inch width. Sometimes it is the peak, and so let's measure and see with this strip. And I only need to do this one time. All the strips are cut identical, but it may vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, from year to year. So here we can see, as I use my 2.5-inch wide, the ruler measuring that 2.5-inch width, I can see that the edge of the 2.5 inches is hitting those peaks. So when I go to match up my strips and sew them, I want those points to be along the edge, not the valley. That plus an inaccurate seam allowance could make, after we sew multiple strips side by side, it could shrink the width of that strip set. So that's just some things to be aware of to help, again, with the accuracy that's going to help pay off down the road as we're piecing multiple pieces together to create these blocks. Okay, so now that I know the width of these pre-cut strips that we're going to work with on our first pinwheel hourglass quilt, I can then break apart my my bundle of pre-cuts and start laying them out. And the one thing to be aware of, so for both these quilts, we're going to work with sets of 4. And as I'm combining as I'm creating those strip sets, one thing to keep in mind is making each one interesting. And to do that, you want to have a contrast. You want to have a variety of colors, of scales, of design, so textures. That's what makes it interesting. If I were to just take all yellow strips and sew them together, it wouldn't be as interesting. Maybe it's the effect you're going for. So if that's what you want to go for, that's great. But if you want some contrast, then I want to get the different colors, different shades. Also scale. I wouldn't want to just do all my prints, even if they're different, this scale, again, it wouldn't be that interesting. But here where I'm mixing some large scale florals, and then I'm going to put it next to this kind of mini hourglass, more geometric print, and then a pink with a kind of a smaller scale floral, and then I've got this busy lighter fabric too. That just creates a little more visual interest and contrast. Now, we want to sew these strips together once we've decided the order. And here's another tip. As you're planning your blocks, you might want to, as you go through the materials, you'll know how many you need to set aside, how many strip sets you need to make. Before I start sewing my strip sets together, I like to plan all of them. So say for this quilt that we're working on next, I need 9 sets. So I need a total of 36 strips. I'm going to create all 9 of those sets. That way I know they're all a little bit different and I know what I have to work with and I can distribute them evenly and create 9 sets that are unique and different. Now, once I know I need to sew these 4 strips together, I've got my 9 sets of 4, and I can get one out at a time. And I want to sew these. Obviously, the edges are, the lengths are gonna to match up. And we know we're gonna have these 3 seams to sew them together side by side. Here is another tip for working with strip sets. And that is, I want to sew 2 sets rather than sewing one strip and then the next and the next into a set of 4. If I do that, and if all my seams are going the same direction, once this is done, this strip set could start to bow. And that comes as a result of the sewing machine. The way the feed dogs pull the fabric from the bottom, it's gonna feed it differently than the piece going in from the top. That top piece is gonna slide under the presser foot, whereas the bottom piece is gonna be tugged and grabbed a little more by the feed dogs. So I wanna sew my seams in different directions. That will help the set stay a little more square and not arc so much. So for example, I could break my strip set into 2 sets, and I would sew this set together first and this set together first. And I've got a couple already, so you can see. Let's move this stuff out of the way. Okay, so I have my 2 sets sewn first. And I'm gonna put them in this order. And I've sewn my seams going this direction. So next I'm gonna press both sets before I go to sew these together. And here's what I like, here's how I prefer to press, and I think this again makes those strips really square and flat. Is the first thing we'll do is set the seam, just iron right over the seam with the strips still closed and facing each other, right sides together. And a nice hot iron makes such a difference here. Now, instead of pressing, I prefer to press all every quilter is different. I prefer, especially with these projects, to press my seam allowances to one side. And so instead of pressing from the back and pressing that seam allowance this way, I like to open it up and press from the front. That way, I can get that tip, that nose of my iron, right into that seam and open it really flat. So I'm just making sure that seam allowance is going to one side. And just gently working that iron tip right into the seam. Get it nice and open and flat. And let's do it really quickly with this other side. You can set that seam really quickly. And just open it up. I love this fabric. I think it's so cheerful. It's always more inspiring to work with fabric you like, isn't it? Okay, let's finish getting this. Okay, so now I have these 2 sets and they're ready for me to sew together. Let's do it this way. Okay. And so I've sewn going this direction, the first 2. So now when I put these right sides together, I'm gonna start at this end, at the bottom, and piece those right into my machine. Just kind of get those edges lined up. I don't typically pin when I'm sewing strip sets together. I don't think you need to. You can if you're more comfortable with that, but I think you'll get pretty confident where you can just put it right through the machine. Just make sure those edges are lined up before you go to stick it under your presser foot. And line up with how you measure a 1/4 inch. Whether you have a 1/4 inch foot, I'm gonna use on this machine this little 1/4 inch line. And this is where we remember using these pre-cut strips with the pinked edge. I'm going to line up these peaks with my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay. And then just carefully feed that through the machine. You let the machine do all the work. Don't pull from the back. You just want the machine to do the work of feeding that through. You're just there to guide it, to keep that edge lined up with your 1/4 inch seam allowance guide. And I stop and I kind of adjust my strips and make sure those edges are still matched up straight, because I didn't use pins. Just carefully guide that through. Adjust. Now, as you can tell, I'm not worried. I'm not worried about these edges. We're just going to trim and square that edge off. But here we go. We have our 4 strips sewn together, and I'm just going to repeat that process of pressing again by setting the seam first of all, and then open up and press that seam from the top, getting it nice and flat. I can even kind of repress the other seams while I'm at it if I didn't do a great job before. So I can even see right there. I need to just flatten that out. Perfect. Now we have a nice strip set ready to go. We're gonna use this for our next project, and by cutting it at different angles and matching it with our contrast fabric, we're gonna make a really fun design really quickly because we already have our strip set ready to go.